The last macronutrient per se that we didn't really talk about are fluids. And I mentioned that fluids are, again, the absolute most important nutrient your body can consume or needs. And this actually affects performance, again, both physical and mental, much more than any other nutrient. So a couple basics about fluids. One, water is the most important nutrient. Again, that's very important to continue to repeat and emphasize. It accounts for about 50 to 60% of overall body mass. Lean body tissues, things like heart and liver and muscles, they actually are about 72 to 75% water by mass, whereas something like adipose tissue, which is fat, is about only 5% mass. So very important to consider or to emphasize the importance of regular fluid consumption throughout training and performance. Let's talk about the basics of why is water so important. One, it helps transport glucose, oxygen, and fats to working muscles, and this is why water in the blood. Number two, it helps eliminate waste products. It absorbs heat from working muscles, so you don't overheat. It regulates body temperature. And it also lubricates joints and cushions, organs, and tissues. That's a lot of important things, a lot of things that water is responsible for. Now, unfortunately, athletes constantly risk dehydration. And I've worked with a lot of clients, and both athletes and non-athletes alike. One thing that we always found is when we tested the hydration status of collegiate football players, 9 times out of 10, they were walking out onto the field mildly dehydrated. And that's scary because it's not just going to affect their physical performance, but dehydration can actually become dangerous. I gave the example of collegiate football players, and maybe you do work with that type of clientele, but it's not just that type of elite level player, athlete, that risks dehydration. And I mentioned that dehydration will hurt performance, both physical and mental. In fact, it only takes about a 2% loss of body weight, which is, think about a 150-pound person, that's about 3 pounds. It takes that little amount of weight loss for them, for their performance to suffer. And again, think about your clientele. That could be if you're running a boot camp and you're working with individuals outdoors, especially if you live in a hot, humid environment, or it could be even in the gym with somebody. If you're working out intensely, that could really hinder their performance. We're not going to, you're probably not going to be physically yourself measuring hydration status, but I want to give these take-home points that's important. And one thing that I always use with athletes, and when I was at the collegiate level, we had access to actually test their hydration in a scientific manner. But let's look at the everyday person, how they're going to determine their hydration status. Well, have your clients look at the color of their urine, and not the most appealing thing to think about, but very, very simple rule of thumb. If their urine looks like apple juice, they are dehydrated. If it looks like pale lemonade and there's a more abundance of it, then they are more well hydrated. Another easy rule of thumb, if somebody gets thirsty, they are already starting to become mildly dehydrated. So really, really important. Another easy thing to do is, have a client weigh themselves without clothes before and after a workout. And that difference in weight will be primarily from fluid losses. So it's not going to be from fat loss, much to the client's dismay. So keep that in mind. If they're losing that body weight during the workout, they can be negatively affected. The key then is to talk about rehydration, and it's recommended to consume about 20 to 24 or so ounces of non-alcoholic fluid for every 1 pound lost. I think it's important to also discuss about the signs and symptoms of dehydration. So if a client maybe having some of these, you can really you could determine what might be going on. So some common signs and symptoms of dehydration include, but not necessarily limited to, muscle cramps, intense thirst, weakness, irrational behavior, reduced performance, headache, nausea, fatigue, dizziness, and confusion. All common signs of dehydration. So kind of keep those in mind as you're working with clients. rather than focusing on that negative, the dehydration end of things, although it is important, let's talk about the positive, tips for staying hydrated. And keep in mind that any non-alcoholic food or beverage counts towards daily fluid intake. And I say food because foods actually account for approximately 30% of total fluid intake. And that's a heck of a lot. And the more fruits and vegetables you eat, the higher that is. So things like watermelon, which are 92 or so percent water, think about how much that will account for your fluid intake. Now, a couple tips for staying hydrated. One, recommend to your clients to carry a water bottle with them during training sessions and aiming for an intake of approximately 16 ounces, which is 2 cups per session. Again, this is dependent on overall body weight and sweat volume, but again, you're not going to be measuring sweat volume and things like that, depending on your clientele. So, just recommending they're drinking a couple cups during your training session and not forgetting about that. Also, it's important to consider not just immediately before and after and during your training, but keeping regularly hydrated throughout the day is important. Sports drinks can play a crucial role in terms of performance, but that typically unnecessary for individuals unless their activity is lasting over 60 minutes. So that's important. They can play an absolutely important role in the right types of clients, but not everybody needs a sports drink. If clients, sometimes I hear that, I'm bored, I don't like water, it makes it difficult to drink. Well, a couple suggestions, have them squeeze a lemon or lime or orange or some kind of citrus fruit into the water to give it some flavor. Also, we make sure that you always have cold water available because cold water is often more palatable to individuals. Plain water is absolutely an adequate way to effectively rehydrate the body, again, unless we're talking about those athletes over the 60-minute period. And then finally, alcohol beverages do act as diuretics, meaning that they actually can dehydrate you. So keep that in mind. So making sure you're drinking non-alcoholic beverages frequently throughout the day, monitoring that urine color. Remember, pale lemonade, great. Dark apple juice and low volume, bad. Very simple general rule of thumb. But hydration is something that cannot be forgotten about when thinking about nutrition and talking about just general nutrition recommendations or simple guidelines for your clients.